Hello to you, wherever you find yourself in time and space. If you're in the tech industry or work in a job where technology is used, or just read the news, chances are you've heard about this nebulous topic called ethics in AI, or ethics in artificial intelligence, or ethical AI. Now that we have computers and software that can do things and produce things that look and feel like human reasoning and analyze huge data sets to discover things humans can't figure out, how do we ensure we build these things called artificial intelligence in an ethical way? To help me make sense of this, I've reached out to someone who specializes on the topic. Katrina Ingram is the founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on helping organizations to drive better outcomes in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. So, Katrina, welcome.
Thanks so much.
I want to start at the very baseline here. Can you explain what AI or artificial intelligence actually means in this context?
I love this question because it should be one of those, hey, tell me what the basic definition is, but it's actually kind of complicated in some respects. So there are official definitions about autonomy and machines being able to make some level of decision making. But the reason it's complicated is because this idea of what is AI kind of lives in our imagination. And the goalposts for what it is keep shifting and moving forward. So it starts becoming anything a computer can't do right now becomes this idea of AI. And if you think about it, when I say the word AI, many people probably have this vision of the Terminator or some kind of like Hollywood movie, some robot, some kind of thing that's come to exterminate humanity. And so this idea of this imaginary being, this creature that has super intelligence, comes to mean what we think about when we think about AI today. But if you were asking me this question maybe 20 years ago, some of the technology that we have right now that everybody has, like smartphones, maybe that would seem like the magical technology. But now we've just kind of adapted to the baseline, so to speak. So that's why it becomes hard to define.
Yeah, because I'm a science fiction connoisseur. I read a lot of science fiction because it bookends well with my philosophy background, like this idea of possible futures and thought experiments. And AI in science fiction generally takes the shape of like some sort of Terminator type hellscape where computers become smarter than people and then in some way tries to subjugate humans because humans are inferior. Though there are some alternatives, like the movie AI based on Isaac Asimov's story, which is more of like the AI as a helper in society that kind of replaces human relationships. And then there's the whole idea of AI as actual sentience, or a general AI that is actually sentient and therefore has to have rights like humans. But what we're talking about in AI, like today, if you went out into the world and said, oh, we are working in AI, or this AI is doing that. What is that thing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a thing called narrow AI, and you can think of it as a technology that kind of does one thing really, really well. So some of the things that I think about when I think about AI today are kind of boring technologies. So things like the systems that filter your email for spam, or the systems that monitor your bank account for fraud. They're kind of looking for pattern matching and looking for, the email that sort of looks like spam, we'll put that in your junk folder. And so that's the kind of AI that we have in the world today. And we're all interacting with it all the time. We just don't really think about it. So it's kind of like this invisible infrastructure. You don't really think about it until something breaks. That's when you think about infrastructure. So if you think about like driving down a road, you don't really notice the road unless there's like a pothole on the road, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, I got to like navigate around that pothole. It's sort of the same with this digital infrastructure. And that's where this topic of AI ethics comes in, because it sort of starts to point at where is the digital infrastructure breaking down and who is it breaking down for? And this is really why one of the reasons I'm kind of attracted to this field of AI ethics.
Right, because the interface that we have with AI, or basically like glorified machine learning algorithms today, is often frustrating in that it's so dumb, right? Like you talk to your Google Home or your Alexa and you say like, play this, and then it plays some random music that is not at all what you asked for, or you ask it a question and it can't answer your question. And everyone's had this experience of like going on a social media platform and then doing something and then being fed ads that clearly somehow pattern match something you were doing, but the pattern is super, super wrong. So it's like the words are right, but the actual product is completely off the charts wrong. So I think people have this feeling of both this, science fiction driven fear of AI is going to destroy everything and take my job, while at the same time, this kind of underwhelmed, these systems can't even figure out the most basic things. So why should I care? And that's where this whole, there's this tension, right? There are people like you who say, ethics in AI is vitally important right now. And then the human experience of AI right now is this stuff can't even figure out how to order my product correctly. So why am I concerned about this? So why is AI ethics important? And how do you define AI ethics or ethics in AI?
Yeah, well, in fact, you've kind of set it up really nicely, Morten. And so I think there's this sense that, well, we don't need to be concerned about it until we get into that existential risk of the Terminator and superintelligence. But I would say that we need to be concerned about these not so intelligent systems making really, really important predictions, inaccurate predictions about certain people. So there's this push to drive efficiency, to drive productivity. That's really what's kind of making a lot of organizations embrace AI technologies. And these are organizations that are not just serving up advertising. That certainly is one thing that AI can do, but they're making important life decisions about people. So they're making decisions about who should get a loan, who should get access to education, who should get access to healthcare. And so these are big events that can have adverse life consequences if you're the person who's decided against. So if for example, some AI system that's not very smart and has a bunch of data that's maybe not even accurate about you makes a decision that you're not getting that loan or you're not getting access to education, that can really impact you. And in a lot of cases, you don't even know that that's happening.
Yeah, there was there's been talk of like algorithmic bias in the tech ethics community for a long time now. And one of the things that keeps popping up is this AIs are basically machine learning algorithms that are trained on data sets. And the data sets, if the data sets carry bias within them, which they always do, then that bias gets amplified by these AIs to the point where they almost become like bias surfacing mechanisms. Like they will show you where the bias is because they amplify it. And then this last week, someone, I forget, like the head of IBM or something, went out and said, we need to stop focusing on AI bias. Did you see this story?
I've heard similar stories. I haven't seen this particular one, but I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. So
is your question, should we stop focusing on bias or?
Well, both why is AI bias such a focus? And also, is the focus on AI bias alone kind of taking away from something larger?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. So yes, it is taking away from something larger. That doesn't mean it's not important, but it also can suck the air out of a room in terms of the conversation and become a focus. And I think the reason it's attractive as a focus is because there are a lot of people that feel that this area has a lot of technical fixes. So think about the kinds of people that are working in this industry, a lot of data scientists, a lot of people who are well-versed in statistical problem solving. And so this idea of bias in their mind becomes a math problem to be solved. If we just had the right data, the right representations, the right numbers in place, we can then make sure it's fair for everyone. But if you step back and you really think about the world, it's not constructed in ways that are fair. And we have to confront these other issues that really don't have technical fixes. They might have political fixes. They might have social fixes. And really, we have to grapple with this idea of power structures and who has power in a relationship, how technologies are being used by whom, for what purposes. And these are bigger questions that are, they're a lot bigger than debiasing a data set. And so do I think bias is important to consider? Absolutely. But do I think it's the full picture? Absolutely not. We need to also have this bigger conversation. So I think that's where some of these articles are coming from. They're coming from the sense of if we just solve for debiasing data sets, we might be missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, because I collect articles about this general topic of tech ethics, and it's very interesting to me to see how the conversation very often quickly burrows into the technical details of like, well, if like facial recognition is a problem because of bias, then we just need more data into the facial recognition systems, right? Or if sentencing bots that you hand sentencing adjudication over to a bot to make it more fair, and then it heavily has negative impacts for people of darker skin tones than of lighter skin tones. And then they go, well, this is just because we are lacking data. And I feel like this constant return to, well, there's nothing wrong with the technology, it's just that lacking data is very much a problem, because we're not seeing this. The conversation should be at a higher level, which is, how are these things used in society, and should we be using them in the right way? And I think the best example I can think of is several years ago, there was someone who had taken Google Maps data and combined it with Google Street View data and some other data set. I cannot quite recall what it was, but it was some DMV data set. And what they did was they created an AI bot that would go through the streets of Los Angeles and then look at what types of cars were parked along the street. And from there, predict the socioeconomic tier that street was on. And then they collated that data with, actual socioeconomic data. And they found that the data derived from the maps and the pictures of cars in the street was more accurate than the data derived from like census. And then they immediately sold that data to advertisers, right? Because they were like, oh, we have this amazing data set of where rich people live and where middle-class people live and where poor people live that is super accurate. And that is not a data problem. That is a whole other kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that story, but I've heard similar ones. And the other models. So there's models in terms of AI and machine learning, but there's also models in terms of business and organizations, and those are models I think we also need to interrogate. So this whole idea of the ad economy and driving everything so that we can aggregate data and sell it to advertisers, we haven't examined that enough in terms of, did we sign up for this? I don't think we did when we agreed to these long and complicated terms and conditions for using social media and using apps. We're not also sitting there thinking, oh, somebody's going to aggregate this data and sell it to a bunch of people. We didn't really sign up for this, and yet we're enmeshed in it. We're immersed in it. And so I think we do need to have this conversation about the ad model that powers all of this technology. And it's a trade-off, because the other piece that is held out as the carrot is, well, it's free. You get to use these things for free, but you're really paying with your data at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's the whole surveillance capitalist problem, which is an enormous and nebulous problem, that there's this whole layer that's been built on top of our technologies now that is based on this assumption that we should be able to derive value out of every user for every use. And the way we do that is by collecting all the data we can, then using it to target advertising to the user, to the point where the system becomes an advertising machine, rather like the focus on providing whatever service is there has gone. And instead it's just a focus on how do we get as much data as possible and subject as much ads as possible to the user, which is, something very complicated.
It is. It's really interesting. Just as a thought experiment, since you're a philosopher, and I imagine some of the audience members might be as well, I've often considered this idea. So we have this advertising model where it's like we're all just, data. We're all data suppliers. We're all putting all this data into this model, and at some point, somebody in power is going to serve that back, and we're going to have shoe ads, or sunglass ads following us around on the internet. So that's happening. At the same time, our jobs are being automated away. There's talk of someday maybe getting to a super intelligence that automates away a large portion of our work. And so we see this great disparity of, a few people at the top of a pyramid and many people with not very much in the middle, kind of collapsing out of our systems. And, you have to wonder, like, what is the end game here? If average people maybe don't have the resources anymore, we're in a time of like hyperinflation at the moment to purchase all of these things. So what if people are advertising all this stuff at you, if you don't even have the resources? I don't understand it from the business. I don't get the business model for this. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't know if people have really thought this through. So I wonder about that.
That is a very good point, that there's no point trying to sell something to someone if that person just doesn't have the money to buy it. And I guess that's also why you see so much of this, like the fast fashion and the very cheap products and very low quality products being heavily marketed on social media, because you can hit like an audience that is not willing to spend a lot of money. But yeah, there is like a larger conversation around like what is the goal of capitalism if capitalism creates this massive divide in society where it becomes impossible to climb from the bottom to the top. Because if it's skewed towards the top and everyone at the bottom can't do anything about it, like what is the purpose of this whole mechanism? So there was someone here who asked a really good, straightforward question. It says, is AI going to help us in the future? I think that closely relates to what you work with.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's so many different pieces to this, like in terms of help in what way. And I would say, in some ways, like, okay, if we think about, is AI useful right now? Well, here, you and I are in different cities. We're on a platform. It's being mediated by lots of different systems that have some smart capabilities empowering it. Is this helpful? We're connecting. We're connecting with each other. We're connecting with an audience. I would say, perhaps AI is helping us now in some way. So I would say that, again, it comes back to the purpose, and it comes back to who is in control. So when we think about help, we sort of think about, well, things that are done in my benefit and not working against me. And so there is this level, I think, of helping even right now. I wonder if this person might also be thinking about sort of that, the Jetsons future of the robot helper that does everything around your house and everything like that. I think we're pretty far away from that kind of help. So it really sort of depends on how we want to frame the question and what time frame we want to look at.
Let's slightly modify the question to say, how do we build AI so that it helps us in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that I think is really important is to think about who gets the opportunity to imagine the future and shape the future and build the future. Whose version of the future are we going to build? And what concerns me right now about this field is that it's a very small, homogenous group of people who get to design that future. And I think we all know the kinds of people that I'm talking about. They're kind of those billionaire Silicon Valley types, mostly men, from a certain socioeconomic demographic. And so what about the rest of us? Do we get to design and weigh in and say what kind of future we want to have? I think that's a really important conversation that we need to have in order to get to this idea of what is actually going to be helpful for people. Because it's really going to be different for different groups of people. And so we need to have like a bigger conversation and more inclusion and more people who are, part of building this future. So I think that is super key and foundational to all of this.
Yeah, there's some great questions coming in here. So Tracy's asking, is it possible to fix AI without fixing the social systems we live within? Which relates directly to what you just said.
Yeah.
That it's not, there's a technology layer, but there's a higher level of who is in this conversation.
Yeah, I think, again, like when we say fix, can we put some Band-Aids on it? Sure, we can. We can put some Band-Aids on it. We can debias some data sets, and we can make these small fixes, let's say, to make it better. And I'm not, just to be clear, I think that's okay. Like, I think there needs to be a bit of this harms mitigation type approach to AI while we're working on also not losing sight of, but working on the bigger social systems. So again, it's sort of the balance of making sure we're mitigating the harms today so that they're less harmful, But we also have to have the bigger aspiration of why are we creating this, all of these technologies if we're going to have an adversarial relationship with them? What's the point of that? I don't want to spend, the rest of my time just fixing and putting band-aids on things. I would like to get to this bigger conversation that Tracy is mentioning.
Yeah, and it's very much like, because Jonathan also asked a question that relates to this, which I'm bringing up because it highlights this dichotomy here between some people think of technology as separate from society or people, and others think of technology and society as being one and whole. So what Jonathan is espousing is the first view. Like there's, it's not ethics of AI, it's the ethics of the people who are building AI as two different things.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jonathan. It is about the people who are building it and the people who are funding it and the people who are impacted by it. It's always about the people. But I think there is this narrative, and again, it's held out there because of those who are in power to center it on the technology. And I agree that we need to kind of like challenge that and decenter that narrative and really kind of make it about the people and their ethics. What are the ethical choices that they are making? And that's something I do talk about a lot in my work and in the courses that I've been working on developing, is how do you make better ethical choices as someone in this system, particularly if you're building or deploying AI systems.
Okay, so let's do this. If you are like, the ruler of the space and you get to make decisions, right? What are the fundamental ethical principles you want to see applied to AI development?
Yeah. So in a lot of the work that I'm doing, there's a number of papers where they tried to like distill all of these ethical principles and ethical frameworks. There's hundreds of them, hundreds of these things that have popped up in the last few years. And there's kind of like 5 ethical core principles. And I will say, I'll put a caveat on this. This is a bit of a Western philosophical perspective. So I think that there are other perspectives that should be considered, but the ones that tend to come up are so beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, autonomy, and explainability. And so the first 4 you might recognize from other principles like bioethics. So, the do no harm principle in kind of the realm of medicine, for example. So those are core ethical considerations that have been borrowed, let's say, from other disciplines. The last one, explainability, sometimes it's called explicability, is unique to AI. And it kind of gets at this notion that these systems in some cases are a black box. We don't really know what they're doing. And so if we don't know what they're doing, how can we make good autonomous choices for ourselves if we don't really understand it? Or how do we know it's fair and not creating injustices if we don't understand it? So those are kind of the 5 that are held up as core ethical principles from a Western perspective. I also think we need to think about more holistic perspectives too, such as impacts to the environment. A lot of times we don't consider how these technologies that are kind of invisible, they feel kind of, ephemeral, are actually connected to environmental issues as well. When we think about the amount of electricity to live an always on AI powered life, or all of the, the rare earth minerals that are in the technologies that we're using, the digital technologies, and how those are extracted. So I think that those kind of environmental principles also weigh into it. So those are things I would think about. First of all, I don't want that responsibility of being that ruler. I'd very quickly gather a group of people to have a conversation about this.
I think the explainability part is very interesting in this space in particular, because there are stories that keep popping up that are somewhat concerning. So, the premise of the Terminator and a bunch of these futuristic dystopian AIs is that the AI kind of runs amok, right? Like it becomes self-aware enough that it can develop itself and develop new language and start making models that aren't what was intended, right? Several years ago, there was a story of how, I believe it was Google, but don't quote me on it, where they had a language AI that was trying to translate, language A to language B. And when they started looking closely at it, they discovered it had invented a new language in between. that was like a proto language that it would use to like translate into that language and then out of that language into another thing. And it was the proto language that made it super, super accurate. But they could not understand how the AI had made the language to begin with, and B, how that language worked. Like they could not figure out how this proto language functioned. And because they couldn't figure it out, they turned it off. They were like, this is not safe. And it's one of those weird things where you go and say, it's a translator. Why is this? How is this not safe? But you could see, like, I remember reading the article and thinking, I don't think that decision would have been made the same way. Like back then, I was thinking, if this happened again, they won't turn it off, right? Because this is that whole like you get numb to technology advancing. But back when this happened, they were like, oh,
Yeah.
it invented its own language. We didn't tell it to do that. That's not okay. And then they just wiped it, right? And
Yeah.
I think that is part of it, that the people who work with this stuff have to be aware enough to think, if a thing I built does something on its own or in a direction that I didn't intend, if I can't understand it, I can't let it continue because I don't know where it'll take it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to hear you share that story. And I'm thinking about a book called Human Compatible, and it was written by a professor named Stuart Russell. And Stuart Russell is a big deal in the space of AI. He co-wrote one of the main textbooks that most people who study AI and machine learning use. And so this book, Human Compatible, though, it's really about this issue of AI safety and the idea of could we actually incorporate the kill switch, the ability to turn things off? And at what point do we pass, the point of being able to turn something off if we allow things to go down a certain trajectory, as you've just described? And he came to this moment. He describes it in the book. He came to this moment because he went to watch the film Transcendence with Johnny Depp. So some of you might remember this film where Johnny Depp plays this AI system that kind of takes over the world. It sets itself up with this big data center in the desert and starts buying real estate and taking over the world. And anyways, so this is an actual professor who's kind of referencing a Hollywood moment to start to do work on this issue of AI safety. And I just think it's a really interesting commentary on where we're at. Because in this book, he also explains that there are some people in his field who basically say, well, we'll never get to AGI, so why should we worry about these issues? That's the stuff of fiction. So it's almost like they're betting against themselves in a weird way. It's sort of like the cancer doctor saying, well, we'll never cure cancer. It's these AI researchers saying we'll never get to super intelligence. So anyway, Stuart Russell is an interesting character and is doing some really interesting things with his writing and his work in this field.
Yeah, and I think that what you're touching on there, this idea of general AI, right? The general intelligence that is close to sentience or is able to think in the random way that human beings are able to think, is both the lofty goal of AI research, but also the point where all the dystopian science fiction stuff starts becoming a very big concern. And what you're saying, like, we'll never get there. It's funny because I feel like the people that are saying that, that we'll never get there, it's almost tongue in cheek, right? It's almost like we won't get there today or tomorrow or maybe even 5 or 10 years from now. But it's very clear that the bridge that's being built is a bridge heading in that direction. But because it feels so impossible, everyone's like, no, don't worry about it now. But then you run into this, like, if you're on a slippery slope and you keep saying, well, it's not that slippery, while someone is like pouring more oil in it. But what if it was?
Yeah.
Let's see if we can make it more slippery. It's not. We're not going to go to the bottom, but we could make it a little more. There's this whole tension within the space of this. There are things that I think everyone agrees are dangerous. I mean, you hear about like this Elon Musk and all these other people that have like an AI alliance, and they're talking about how all AI development needs to happen in a closed box so that it can't leak into the world, while at the same time building self-driving cars that run. It's like you're talking with two mouths here. These two
Yeah.
things are incompatible to each other. And then you have people like you who sit on the ethics side and say, hey, so we can deal with these things, but you have to actually deal with them. You can't just, act as if this stuff is inevitable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, again, going back to this issue of power and agenda setting and who's controlling the narrative. And so when I think about AI has gone through, so when we think about AI, we think a lot about what's happening today, but we have to remember that this field started about 50 years ago. So the term artificial intelligence was first coined in 1955, and the field of AI was kind of established at this very famous conference, summer conference that took place in Dartmouth in 1956. And at that time, they thought they'd have everything figured out by the end of summer, which is so laughable now, 50 years later. But it's gone
have to
through.
Be precise. It's like
Yeah.
70 years now.
70 years. There you go. And we're still having these conversations, but it's gone through a lot of different iterations. And the thing I wanted to mention is this idea of an AI winter. So an AI winter was a time where, so AI kind of overpromises and then it underdelivers. And when it underdelivered, and it's done this a couple of times now, all the funding got pulled, all the people who, thought they would work in AI went, ooh, I don't want to work in AI, nothing going on there. And so there were these times where AI was very unfashionable. It was very uncool to work in AI. We're in the middle of a big hype cycle right now where it's super cool to be a data scientist and work in AI. And I think the fear, as you kind of go back to why are these narratives kind of, conflicting in some ways, I think there is a fear that if the narrative isn't such that this is all full of possibility, maybe the funding might get pulled again, or maybe something will happen. And so those that are in power and I think really have an agenda here to meet want to make sure that doesn't happen, that we never see an AI winter. So I think that's part of what you're seeing go on here.
Mm-hmm. So I want to shift gears a little bit because in reading your profile and looking you up and seeing what you work on, you've done a fair bit of work on the intersection between AI and healthcare, which is a extra spicy box of hornets inside the can of worms. And I reached out to some of my friends to say, like, if you got to talk to someone who works with ethics and AI, what would they talk about? And they all honed in on that immediately because they're all like, I see this happening in real life, and I have many questions. So I wanted to bring up a couple of those questions because so I'll start with a straightforward one, which is where do you see the opportunity to grow an AI in the healthcare industry that wouldn't put citizens at risk?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things being done in the field of research right now, medical research. And I had the chance to talk with a lot of medical researchers last year. So I made a podcast with the University of Alberta, and it was very focused on this area of precision health. So I'm not going to say this is 100% without risk, but because it's within the realm of research, there's a lot of controls that are taking place. So there's researchers who are using machine learning technologies to process a lot of data. And I remember one researcher in this diabetes field telling me they could take a research study that would take 10 years and reduce it down to 5. So they were kind of getting faster and faster and being able to implement more research outcomes. And so because it's a controlled environment and it's in the realm of research, I think that holds some really interesting possibilities. There's a lot of other researchers that I was able to talk to as part of this series that had similar stories. And so when you think about ethics in a university setting and researchers, you think about review boards and people who are carefully guarding access to data and so forth. So there's a lot of guardrails that are being applied in that research community.
Yeah, and this, I think this also highlights this constant tension that we have between how, it's easy to see that there are dangers in the technology, but then there are also these huge opportunities, and balancing those two things becomes challenging. I mean, you hear stories about this, like there's always this focus on bringing advanced medical services to the global south. And a very common refrain you hear from companies that work with AI, whether it be Microsoft or Google or someone else, is we invented thing X that allows you to use a smartphone to take picture of thing and then send it to AI, and AI is able to diagnose whatever, be it eye disease or diabetes or cancer or infections or whatever. And when you look at the studies, they're very clear in that the cost of doing these things goes from healthcare worker in the field with advanced equipment to any person with a cell phone and an internet connection. And the cost of the processing goes from doctor sitting in an office, doing slides, whatever, taking hours and hours and hours and just feeding it into data model. And then it spits out something. And then someone just looks at it and says, this passed the smell test. So there's this huge, there's this huge apparent benefit. And then to me, the question becomes, how do we do this in a responsible way so that, for one, we don't offload, or if you are poor or underserved, then you get the AI doctor. But if you are rich and live in Western society, you get a human doctor, which I can totally see would happen. And even within Western society, you would have the societal differences, but depending on where you are on the socioeconomic scale, you would go from kind human person to an email, and you would never talk to a real person. And then you also have this question of how do we figure out where an AI may actually be a better server of whatever need you have than a human? And in that case, what happens to those humans that used to do the job if they are no longer necessary?
Yeah, what a great bunch of questions. First of all, I think that we don't have this in the field of medicine, but I'll draw an analogy here. We have this already in the field of investment. So think about robo-advisors. Think about all the people who want to have financial advice. And we can't necessarily all afford a fancy investment advisor unless we have a lot of money. So the people who have lots of money, millions of dollars, they get an actual person. Others of us are left with Wealthsimple or some kind of a robo advisor. And so there is an analogy to be drawn in that, what if that model applies in other areas? What would that look like? And what does that mean for healthcare? I think one of the things that comes up for me is this idea of, you don't want to necessarily put technology out there that's having people self-diagnose. I think this could be incredibly dangerous. We already kind of do this a little bit with WebMD, don't we? We go in that we're like, oh, I got this thing going on, and let me just do some research. And then we go to our doctor.
No, my arm is coming off at the third joint.
Yes. And so
actually a splinter.
So we don't want to do that. And so we need to be careful when we're kind of thinking through how this is going to work and what this is going to look like. We also make a lot of assumptions about who has access to technology. And I'll just share an example of a presentation that I sat in on. This is obviously pre-COVID a few years ago, but it was a talk that was being given, and it was about women and cell phones. And this researcher was doing some research in Bangladesh. And in a lot of contexts, the family had one cell phone for the family. So it wasn't like this one-to-one relationship where it's like my cell phone and your cell phone, which is what we're used to here. It was sort of like this shared resource. And so so imagine, the shared resource and privacy issues, let's say, with that resource in the context of healthcare. So even making assumptions about who has access to, scan something with an AI with their own cell phone, I think is a little bit presumptuous if we don't understand the context of the communities that we're talking about. So I think that there's, further work that needs to be done there as well. But this, you've hit on this bigger theme of the idea that technology will reduce costs by abstracting away or removing labor from a system. And that, I think, is really what it will happen, not just in healthcare, but in other domains. And that is what is happening. And that's why these technologies are being pursued. So it is interesting, I think, to consider what does that mean in the context of a healthcare system when it's public, but also when it's private. Mm-hmm. Think about the US and think about if somebody knew that somebody was more likely to have XYZ health condition, would an insurer want to insure them anymore? Probably mm-hmm. not, because that would be higher risk for that insurer. So it has all kinds of different kinds of considerations that we need to take into account.
Yeah, there's this Black Mirror-esque part of this, which is, you hear, about this thing where you can like plug this chip into your car and it'll give you analytics of your car. And then in some in the United States, there are some insurance companies that say, hey, if you plug this into your car, then we'll give you better rates. And what they're actually doing is monitoring your driving habits. So they're saying like if you're driving very aggressively or a lot of sudden stops or whatever, then they'll be like, oh, there's probably a teenager in the house or someone who's very aggressive, so we're going to like up your rates. And it's actually not, it's sold as this how to save money, but it's actually like constant monitoring of your driving. And let's see, 2017-ish, there were all these stories surfacing of insurance companies that would give people these smartwatches or smart trackers and then say, if you wear this, we'll give you better rates. And it was really them saying, we're going to monitor your activity. And if you drop below a certain threshold, then all of a sudden your insurance goes up. And it's basically a way for the insurance company to say, like, based on our data models of all these people, we can see that you fall into this category that is a higher risk category. And we're siphoning that data off. But I myself, I put my data into a system just to see what it would spit out. Like, I anonymized it and was behind a VPN. I just threw my data into a system to see what it would say. And having some background knowledge in certain things, I did this. And it came back to me and said that I was severely ill. And it rated me at 100%. And the reason for that was because my resting heart rate is abnormally low, and I have very high rates of certain certain byproducts in my blood, right? Which I know are not actually problems because I'm just very healthy and I have connective tissue issues, so my resting heart rate is lower. And the other thing is a side effect of some genetic thing that does nothing. It just makes the number high, right? But because if you take a large data set and you put an anomaly into the data set, the anomaly will be interpreted as illness, right?
Yeah.
Because it'll match up with whatever. And I kind of knew that was going to happen, which is why I tested it. And then when it came back to me, I was like, yeah, okay, so this is not trustworthy. But you see it in all these extremely fit people who try to get insurance and they weigh too much because they have too much muscle. And the insurance company is using BMI as an indicator. So they're like, oh, you're morbidly obese. And the person in front of them is like this, super, super fit person that just weighs a ton because of muscle. And there's this, it's this constant tension between data-driven decision-making and reality. And I feel like the AI puts a permanent wedge in that and says, if we use AIs to do things, we are always erring on the side of data-driven decision-making.
We are, and it's gotten to a point where if you don't have the data, you're questioned in your decision making, and so there is this imperative in almost every situation to come with the data, and in fact let the data make the decision for you. But as you're illustrating, there are points when you think about data. When I talk about data, I always think about why does data exist? Not just what it is, but why does it exist? And a piece of data exists in the world because somebody wanted it to exist. So I use the example of our heart rate. So right now you have something, I think, that's monitoring your heart rate, right? Your smartwatch. I don't. So heartbeat right now, my heartbeat isn't really data. Not at this point. It's not really data. Now, if I had something that was monitoring it, it's turning it into data. And I might be the person saying, yeah, I want that to exist as data, just as you are right now. But somebody's making a decision at some point to capture something. And so data is almost more accurately described as capturing something. And then if you don't have the data points that you need to make a decision, you use a proxy. So you decide, okay, well, I think BMI is a good enough indicator of health. We're going to use that as our data point. And then you drive from there. And sometimes you drive in a very wrong direction from there. And so these are the things that can happen when we think about data. First of all, somebody has to capture it. And then secondly, we need to, we in many cases, make inferences from that data and that put you in a group that are people like you. So you should sort of be like this. And if you're not like that, well, then, there's something wrong. You must be ill or something. And obviously that would have super adverse consequences for you. Imagine if you didn't know what you knew, and let's say a doctor was using that AI system and they said,
Mhm.
Morten, I'm so sorry to tell you, it looks like you're really, really ill and we're going to have to, hold you at the hospital and run more tests or something. Imagine how awful that would be, and how disturbing that would be for you and your family in that moment. I mean, it would just cause all kinds of harm unnecessarily.
Yeah. Or if you live in a remote community, like if you live in the Northern Territories in Canada and your only health service is telehealth and it's powered by an AI, it would be extremely disruptive, right? Because it would be, oh, the AI is saying you need, to go to a hospital. Going to a hospital means like getting on a plane and traveling very far to go to a hospital and then be booked in. So you're now in a different province and you're now in a different system. And then being told, actually, no, we did the test and the AI is wrong. Sorry for disrupting your life and creating chaos, but whatever, go back
Yeah.
home. And
Yeah.
and then you get this disparity between, the access to service, which is what I was alluding to, this human
Yeah.
versus machine service.
Well, and it's so interesting because AI, so again, these two narratives. So there's this narrative of, we're really close to kind of like solving all the problems in healthcare with AI. At the same time, and I can tell you this from personal experience, I was working with a doctor who was doing a research study on virtual care and telehealth. And in a lot of cases, the definition of what is telehealth is literally just a phone call, not
Yeah.
even a web call like we're doing. In many cases, people that I spoke with, they didn't even have webcams. They didn't even have basic equipment
Uh-huh.
in the system. And so again, it's this reality of the system as it exists today, with maybe telephone calls, but calling it virtual care and kind of giving us this impression that it's more sophisticated thing than it is right now. I think it's a really interesting kind of narrative that happens in not just in healthcare, but in a lot of different fields.
So you're in this space, right? And you're connected to all these organizations and you're doing the work of bringing ethics into AI. So it must excite you in some way, this AI-ified future, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that it excites me and concerns me at the same time, which is probably why I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now. I think that when I think about different technologies and how they enable new things, I think that's really exciting. And I think AI is a powerful technology, and machine learning more specifically, because that's the way we kind of do AI today, is through machine learning. It may not always be the way that AI is done. But I think that these technologies can be useful, can allow us to, again, do new things. So I think that is exciting. But at the same time, we need to really kind of question how we want to use them and who gets to participate as part of the decision-making mechanism.
Yeah. And I just want to ask, like, have you seen something in the AI space and gone, that that is exactly the right way to go? Like this is the prototypical example of what we should be doing and how it should be done.
I just saw something yesterday. I will share this with you. So this is a story about a group of Maori researchers in New Zealand. And so many Indigenous languages have very, very few speakers left who speak that particular language. So there's a real risk of languages going extinct or dying out. And this particular group, they run a community radio station, but they also found that machine learning could be a really powerful tool to help them ensure that their language could live on in a bigger sphere. And so they're kind of training a Siri-like device to help them with that goal. And I read that story and went, this is resonating on so many different levels for me. This idea of people who have a particular problem that they wanted to solve in their community, embracing a technology, but being led by their own values of how they were going to use that technology, not necessarily being led for commercial purposes, but kind of being led by this bigger vision of doing something that's really beneficial for their community. I think we need more applications like that. And so it really, that really spoke to me, that particular story. And I think what we need to do is empower groups. Again, it goes back to this idea of who gets a seat at the table. Empower groups of people to who are trying to solve a real problem in their community to have access to technologies that might be helpful in doing that. So I think that, that one really stands out to me as a recent example of something really great.
Yeah, and it ticks off a lot of the boxes that you mentioned in your list of things, right? It's understandable, seeing as they can actually do it. It is something that's accessible to people, and there's autonomy in it, and that it's not someone coming from the outside, like the old language researchers that would come into a community and make a written language for them and like redefine the language. It's the community itself doing the work, right?
Yeah.
And it's using technology on their terms rather than on someone else's terms.
Absolutely.
Is there any situation where you would like to see AI being used, like assuming it's used in an ethical way? But are there places in our society right now where you think that AI would, or we would benefit from introducing AI?
That's an interesting question. I spend so much time thinking about where it shouldn't be used. Where should it be used? I mean, I think going back to healthcare again, like one of the reasons I chose to focus a lot of my attention on the field of healthcare is I do think there is an incredible upside to using these technologies well, with a lot of guardrails and regulation, people who are properly trained, a lot of controls put in place. And so I would say healthcare is an area that in general, I think could have a lot of benefits. I do get concerned when I hear about organizations trying to really insert a commercial agenda around healthcare. Google has been doing a lot of that in the US, and because it's a private healthcare system, there seems to be a lot more opportunities to do that. But here in Canada, with a public healthcare system and lots of safeguards around how our data is used, I think there could be some tremendous benefits in that area.
So I'll end on this final question. It's a very large one, so we'll see how far it goes. But because you mentioned regulation, right? And regulation is something that the tech community, it's something that society as a whole struggles with when it comes to technology, because technology moves much faster than legislation does. So you'll often have a technology emerging, and by the time lawmakers start making regulation around it, it has pushed the goalposts so far away from where it should have been that the legislation and the regulation becomes meaningless. So how do we collectively as a society start building meaningful regulation around AI technologies now for the future? So we're not like working after the facts, but we establish things now. And what do you think should go into that type of regulation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is one of the reasons I think ethics plays a role. There's a lot of people that say, well, ethics isn't enforceable, ethics isn't regulation. Why worry about ethics? But I think there is something to be said about training a generation of technology designers to do the right thing, to make good choices. And when I think about ethics, it's often a leading indicator for where regulation will go. So for example, a technology comes into our world, it creates some kind of an issue. There's some kind of an ethical outcry because it's violated some of these principles that we've been talking about. And then eventually the regulators take note and some regulation is made. That seems to be a kind of a pathway that we go on. And so I think like first line of defense perhaps is to have a group of people that are thinking about these issues from an ethical standpoint. And then in terms of the regulators themselves, I think they can be part of that conversation. So I think policymakers very much need a seat at the table in terms of understanding the technological side of things. I think in some cases they've maybe shielded themselves from that a little bit, but they need to kind of be at the table as well and not just say, well, we don't really understand the technology. That's not a good enough answer anymore. And I think we're seeing with congressional hearings and other kinds of mechanisms that we've seen in the last few years that at least some policymakers are seeing that they need to become better educated as well. So I think that's part of it. But kind of going back to one of the questions that your guest asked about these bigger social systems and how we want to move forward societally, that's also a really important piece of the equation too. So it's not just about the technology in a vacuum. It's more about how we want to use these technologies to advance these bigger goals that we have as society, and what is our vision of a future. What does that look like? And so that we can all have a place there. I think that's the kind of work that needs to be done. So yeah, so it's not a small thing by any stretch. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, it relates back to what you said in the very beginning with who makes these decisions about our future and who do they make the decisions for? Which I think is the underlying question for all of these tech ethics conversations is always the same, like who makes the decisions and who live through the
Who
decisions.
lives with the consequences? Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Well, this is fantastic. I know you have a lot of material and content, and you also do workshops and courses and other things. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to just tell people where they can find you, what kind of services you can provide, and where they should go if they want to learn more about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So my home base online is ethicallyalignedai.com. And there you will find access to all of the YouTube videos that I do on these topics. I write a blog. There's a newsletter that you can sign up for if you're interested. We send out the newsletter once a month. And it also talks about the work that I do, which is building educational courses like this AI ethics micro-credential, which you can learn more about on the website, but also workshops with individual companies and training sessions, speaking engagements, and that sort of thing. So you can check out the website if you're interested.
Yeah, and are there other places, the communities? Where do people go if they want to talk to someone about this in a broader sense?
Fantastic communities. I'll share a few that I'm part of. So For Humanity is a wonderful community that's really focused on this idea of risk and AI audits. So they've taken this idea of financial audits and kind of translated it into what would that mean for AI systems. And so this work is active and ongoing. But forhumanity.center is their website. For those who are interested in the work that some amazing women are doing, Women in AI Ethics is another wonderful community that I spend time with. There's lots of great women that are challenging and changing the face of AI and bringing ethics into the conversation. And then the last community that I'll mention is called All Tech is Human. And it's another wonderful community that's doing a lot of work in advancing the conversation in this space.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to add links to all that stuff in the comments afterwards so that everyone can get to it. Katrina, this was a fantastic conversation, very enlightening. And I can see from the comments that a lot of people find a lot of what you're talking about interesting. So thank you very much for joining me on this and helping make sense of this very complicated topic.
Thanks so much for inviting me here. It was really fun.
Yeah. So if you're watching this either right now or in the future, and you think, hey, there's this other topic that I also think would be interesting to talk about, and you'd like me to find someone to talk about it, ping me on whatever platform you can find me on and say, hey, please bring someone on to talk about this topic, because that's the whole point of the series, to talk to interesting people about interesting topics. So until next time, see ya.
Bye.